Hey everyone, we're going to be leaving aside the usual lore discussions and we're going to be talking about something that is actually serious today. This is a topic that I know a lot of the audience here also watches videos from Eckhart's Ladder, something that he talked about a couple of days ago. So we're going to be touching on some similar points here, but I figured getting this more out there can only be a good thing. And much like Eck, I'm going to be throwing this in front of some Squadrons footage because otherwise there's not really much of a visual element to this. But you may be familiar with the author Alan Dean Foster, who within Star Wars has written the original novelization for A New Hope, as well as Splinter of the Mind's Eye, a book that was initially supposed to be a potential sequel for A New Hope if it didn't do well enough to warrant making Empire Strikes Back. So Alan Dean Foster is a really important figure within Star Wars and a really prominent author in general. And this isn't to say that he deserves some sort of special legal treatment. This is just the fact that this is happening to someone so prominent is really indicative of the scale and scope of the problem here. The crux of the problem is that Alan Dean Foster is not getting paid for either of those books that I just mentioned, nor the novelizations of Alien, Aliens, and Alien 3. As is essentially standard within the publishing industry, per his contracts, when sales of these books happen, he is entitled to royalties that he is no longer getting. When Disney purchased Lucasfilm, this was the case with Star Wars and Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and when they purchased 20th Century Fox, this became the case with Alien, Aliens, and Alien 3. And I'm going to put the letter from him up on the screen. All of this information is coming from the Sci-Fi and Fantasy Writers of America, which is a 501c nonprofit organization that operates within the United States and essentially represents authors in matters like this. And they make it clear within their own statement that the fact that this is going public is pretty much unheard of for the president, Mary Robinette Kowal, who wrote this article and was also part of the press conference that they did. I'm going to put a link to that in the description. They are going to be able to describe this much better than I ever will. But again, I thought maybe putting it out there would help do some good for this. In both the specifics and in general, there are huge problems with what Disney is doing here. In specifics, obviously, the main matter is that Alan Dean Foster needs to get paid for his work. And I'm going to talk about what I mean in general in a moment. They describe in the interview or in this press conference that they did with both Alan Dean Foster and his agent Vaughn that over a year ago now, Alan Dean Foster found out he was not being paid for these books anymore, and they started trying to go through Disney. They didn't really get any responses on what's going on, and that's when they go to the SFWA, who tries to intervene on their behalf. But the responses from Disney to all of this has essentially been that when they acquired the rights to these books through Lucasfilm and also for the Alien books through 20th Century Fox, that they were only buying the rights and not the obligations. Now, this is pretty absurd. It is possible to have situations where you are buying the ability to use something, but the responsibility to pay out other obligations from it would go to someone else. But I don't think it's possible that like George Lucas is still paying these authors their dues. There are books obviously that get contracted out by, for example, Del Rey, and then it goes to the publisher and not the rights holder. But these contracts aren't like that. It seems that for the books that were held by Del Rey, or the rights and obligations were held by Del Rey, those authors are still getting paid. This is something that Troy Denning and Michael Stackpole commented on Twitter. They're also very prominent Star Wars authors. It seems like their book deals with Del Rey have always been through Del Rey, and they are still being paid by Del Rey. Michael Stackpole does mention that he did some work with Dark Horse, the comics, which is now paid, or the rights for that and everything are now held by Marvel, and there's a question with him there. I don't know if this means that he hasn't been paid or if he's now unsure of what the status of that is, so I don't want to say too much on that. But essentially, what Disney did was they bought Lucasfilm. They didn't just buy the rights to Star Wars, so it seems very unlikely that there would be a situation with individual author contracts where they bought the rights to publish the work, but they didn't buy the obligations to pay the royalties. And this brings us to the next point about the general behavior that I talked about, where even if that were the case, then all Disney has to do is talk to Alan Dean Foster's agent, and then they can get to the bottom of who Alan Dean Foster has to go to figure out who is supposed to be paying him his royalties and where those royalties are going. even if it is true that Disney wouldn't be owing them to him directly. But as I said here, and as Alan Dean Foster says, and as the president of the SFWA has said, Disney is not responding. They're being essentially stonewalled by the legal department, and that is basically the limit of the response that they have gotten. It's that they do not own the obligations of Lucasfilm. They didn't buy those obligations, but if the obligations were with Lucasfilm, then that seems, again, very unlikely. But again, all they have to do is talk to them. The other problem that Alan Dean Foster mentions in his letter is that in order to talk to them, they are trying to get him to sign an NDA. So they're essentially trying to muzzle him before they would even answer this kind of simple question. They talk repeatedly in the press conference that they did with the president of the SFWA about what the goal of that side of the situation is trying to do is really just right now, they just want to talk. They are not coming forward with a specific financial demand. They are simply trying to get to the bottom of who owes Alan Dean Foster money. If Disney doesn't own the obligations, let's say for the sake of argument that that is correct, but then where do those obligations lie? And that's all they would have to answer. The president of the SFWA, she says that if Disney's legal department would just let them through to talk to the publishing arm, then this would probably be resolved very quickly, and that seems like it would probably be the case, but for whatever reason, the legal arm of Disney is not letting that happen. So hopefully by getting some attention on this, there will be a bit more movement on that. All of them say in this press conference, both Alan Dean Foster, his agent, and Mary Robinette Cole, the president of the SFWA, they all say that this is essentially unprecedented for them. Having to come forward like this is unprecedented for them, having a situation like this is, and the other issue that they talk about throughout this video, or throughout this conference, and the statement that they put up, was that if they're doing this to Alan Dean Foster, who is one of the bigger names, what are they doing with other authors and artists who are not as experienced in the industry and don't kind of have the clout that Alan Dean Foster would? It's especially sad on another level, which they typically stayed away from in the press conference, but Alan Dean Foster and his wife, as he touches on in his own statement, are both suffering from pretty significant medical issues. Alan Dean Foster himself, in I believe 2016, was diagnosed with a pretty advanced form of cancer, and so this money makes a big difference to him. But aside from that, this is not some request for additional funds. This is about money that he is rightfully owed by Disney. This kind of stonewall, even if they believe in their legal position of not owing Alan Dean Foster money, can only be described as absurd, and it's behavior that's frustratingly typical of large corporations like that, where they think because of their weight, they can ignore pretty much or crush any small opposition because there is no ability for an individual or even the representatives of an individual to counter what is one of the most powerful forces in the world, the Disney legal team. And it's incredibly frustrating. So hopefully this is a situation where getting some public light on it forces the legal arm of Disney to put them through to the correct people so Alan Dean Foster can figure out, if not Disney, then who the hell is supposed to be paying him. As they talk about in the press conference, and I'm quoting from Mary Cole here, the contract specifically says that it is binding on successors and assigns, which would be Disney. So they can't make this claim that by buying up Lucasfilm, they bought the assets but not the obligations. That statement on its own is absolutely absurd. You could make a statement that with this specific buyout, they bought out these rights and they didn't buy these obligations, those still rest with someone else, but they bought the company, and it's not that Disney is alleging that Lucasfilm never held this obligation, it's that they didn't buy this obligation, but they bought Lucasfilm. Alan Dean Foster also wrote the Force Awakens novelization, and this is something that Mary Robinette Cole pointed out in the comments on the SFWA post, that contract was held by Del Rey, and that is properly being paid out. So it seems like if the contract was somehow held through Del Rey publishing Splinter of the Mind's Eye and all the previous books, then this wouldn't be a problem because Del Rey is clearly up for paying their obligations. And if it somehow, let's say, hypothetically, it does turn out that this book, the obligations are actually Del Rey's to pay for it, then all the Disney legal team has to do is allow Alan Dean Foster to speak to their publishing branch and speak to someone who is involved in the publishing side, and that would be easily cleared out. Again, that is their demand right now, that they be allowed to talk. That's it. So I do also want to say that what SFWA and what Alan Dean Foster is doing here is really brave. Going up against the legal department of Disney is a monumental task. The fact that Alan Dean Foster didn't sign that NDA and is instead doing this in public in a way that helps make sure that this can't happen going forward to other authors who may be in a more vulnerable position in terms of their career, let alone the personal side, that this is something that we can hopefully start to resolve. The way that you can help kind of signal boost this is using the hashtag #DisneyMustPay on social media. This is something that SFWA is starting to signal boost what they're doing here. Again, I will link to the press release they did as well as the press conference that they did in the description. It's both on the same page. I highly recommend listening to that rather than listening to me. Again, I want to do what I can to kind of get this out there, but in terms of the specific information, they're better to listen to. I am not a lawyer either, so I can't speak too much on the specifics of contract law in the United States, but hopefully the idea is by putting this out there more, Disney will have to respond to them and they can get to the bottom of this. Thanks for watching, everyone.